The sun beat down mercilessly on Dahlia Foster's shoulders as she stood on the auction platform, sweat trickling down her back beneath the worn calico dress that had seen better days, watching the crowd of men below with their eyes ranging from curious to pitying to downright dismissive. Cherry Creek, Colorado wasn't much more than a dusty collection of buildings clustered along the base of the Rockies in this year of 1878. But it was the end of the line for women like her, women who had traveled west on promises of matrimony, only to find themselves stranded, alone, and desperate enough to participate in what the town politely called a social auction, but what everyone knew was really a bride auction for women with nowhere else to turn. The auctioneer, a portly man named Henderson with sweat stains spreading under his arms, cleared his throat for what felt like the 100th time that afternoon. "Now then, gentlemen, we have Miss Dahlia Foster here. She's come all the way from Philadelphia, 22 years of age, can read and write, and has experience keeping house." Dahlia forced herself to keep her chin up, even as she felt the hot sting of humiliation burning through her chest. 3 other women had already been auctioned off that day, each going to miners or shopkeepers who bid anywhere from $50 to $200 for the privilege of having a wife. She had watched as each woman stepped down from the platform, relief visible on their faces despite the uncertainty of their futures. At least they would have food, shelter, and the protection of a man's name in this harsh territory. "Do I hear $20? Henderson called out, his voice carrying across the small crowd that had gathered in front of the general store. Silence. Dahlia's hands trembled slightly, and she clasped them together in front of her, willing herself not to cry. She knew why they hesitated. She wasn't ugly, but she wasn't beautiful either, with her 2 sharp features and the way her brown hair refused to hold a curl. More than that, she was older than the other women had been, and everyone could see the weariness in her green eyes, the exhaustion of someone who had already lived through too many disappointments. $20, Henderson tried again, his voice losing some of its enthusiasm. "Come now, gentlemen, this is a fine woman here. Educated, capable." A few men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a grizzled miner with more beard than face, spat tobacco juice into the dirt and walked away. Another 2 followed. Dahlia felt her stomach twist into knots. What would happen if no one bid? Where would she go? She had exactly $3.40 to her name, barely enough for a week's room and board, and the position she'd been promised as a governess had evaporated when she'd arrived to find the family had already hired someone else. $15. Henderson's voice had taken on a desperate edge now. He caught Dahlia's eye, and she saw the pity there, which somehow made everything worse. The crowd had thinned to maybe a dozen men, most of them looking anywhere but at the platform. Dahlia could hear the whispers now, the words carrying on the hot afternoon breeze. "Too old. Look at her, all worn out already. Probably got a sharp tongue, that one." She wanted to scream at them that she'd been worn down by circumstances beyond her control, that she'd spent the last 2 years caring for an ailing aunt, who'd promised her a small inheritance only for everything to go to creditors when the old woman died. She wanted to tell them that she'd been engaged once, that a man had loved her before he'd been killed in a factory accident back in Philadelphia. But none of that mattered here. Here, she was just another unwanted woman on an auction block, her worth being measured in dollars that no one wanted to spend. $10, Henderson said, his voice barely more than a mumble now. "Surely someone will offer $10. Dahlia closed her eyes. This was it. This was rock bottom. 22 years old and being sold for less than a decent horse. She thought about her mother, dead these past 8 years, and was almost grateful the woman wasn't alive to see this moment. Going once, Henderson said mechanically. "Going twice. $10,000. The voice cut through the dusty air like a knife, deep and steady, coming from the back of the crowd. Every head turned. Dahlia's eyes snapped open, her heart suddenly hammering in her chest. $10,000. That had to be a mistake. No one paid that kind of money for a wife, not even the richest men in Denver. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, and a man stepped forward. Dahlia found herself staring at him, trying to make sense of what was happening. He was tall, maybe 6 feet or more, with broad shoulders filling out a worn but clean cotton shirt. Dark hair showed beneath his hat, and as he came closer, she could see his face was weathered but handsome in a rough way, with a strong jaw and eyes the color of storm clouds. He looked to be in his late 20s, maybe 30 at most, and there was something in the way he carried himself that spoke of both strength and deep exhaustion. "Did you say $10,000? Henderson's voice had gone up an octave, his eyes bulging. "I did." The man reached the platform, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "I have the deed to my ranch here, 3,000 acres north of here, running up into the foothills. Good water, timber rights, grazing land. There's livestock, about 200 head of cattle, some horses. A house, barn, outbuildings. It's worth at least 10,000, probably more. It's all yours if you'll accept it as my bid." "Sir," Henderson sputtered, looking between the man and the paper like he'd lost his mind. "This is highly irregular. The bid is meant to be cash, and surely you don't mean to offer your entire property for—" "I know exactly what I'm offering." The man's voice was firm. He looked up at Dahlia then, and she found herself unable to look away from those gray eyes. "Miss Foster, I'm Kane Keller. I run a cattle ranch about 10 miles north of here. I'm offering you everything I have, and in return, I'm asking you to be my wife. It's honest work, hard work, and lonely. The house isn't fancy, but it's solid. I can promise you 3 meals a day, a roof over your head, and that I'll never raise a hand to you in anger. I can't promise much more than that, but what I have is yours if you'll take it." Dahlia's mind reeled. She'd heard of grand gestures, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. A man offering his entire livelihood for a woman no one else wanted. It made no sense. There had to be a catch, some reason he was doing this. Why? The word came out as barely more than a whisper, but in the sudden silence of the crowd it carried. Kane Keller's expression shifted, something painful flickering across his features before he answered. "Because I know what it's like to be the one no one wants, and because everything I built means nothing if there's no one to share it with. I need a wife, and you need a husband. Seems like we might be able to help each other." Henderson was still fumbling with the deed, his hands shaking. "This is quite extraordinary. Miss Foster, you would be within your rights to accept this offer, though I must say I've never seen—" "I accept." Dahlia spoke before she could talk herself out of it, before the fear could overwhelm the desperate hope that was suddenly flooding through her. "I accept your offer, Mr. Keller." A murmur went through the crowd, but Kane's face remained steady, though she thought she saw relief flash through his eyes. He climbed up onto the platform in one smooth motion, and Henderson, looking dazed, mechanically went through the rest of the ceremony. Within minutes, Dahlia found herself signing papers that she barely read, her hand shaking so badly she could hardly hold the pen. "There's a preacher over at the church," Kane said once the paperwork was done. "If you're willing, we could make this legal before sundown." Dahlia nodded, not trusting her voice. This was happening so fast, too fast, but what choice did she have? At least Kane Keller had kind eyes, at least he'd been honest about what he was offering. That was more than most men would have done. They walked to the church together, Kane keeping a respectful distance beside her. The crowd had dispersed, but Dahlia could feel eyes watching them from windows and doorways. She knew the gossip would be flying through Cherry Creek by nightfall, the story of the desperate bride and the rancher who'd given up everything for her. "You don't have to be afraid of me," Kane said quietly as they walked. "I meant what I said. This is a business arrangement if that's how you want to see it. You need security and I need help running the ranch. If more comes of it in time, that's well enough. If not, you'll still have a home and a name." "Why did you really do it?" Dahlia asked, finding her voice. "You could have any number of women. Why bid on me and why offer so much?" Kane was quiet for a moment, his boots crunching in the dusty street. "My father was a drunk and a gambler, lost everything we had when I was 15. My mother died that winter, couldn't survive without proper shelter or food. I spent the next 15 years building that ranch from nothing, proving I was worth something despite where I came from. But lately, I've been thinking about what it's all for. I'm 31 years old and I go home every night to an empty house. I eat alone, I wake up alone. The work's starting to feel pointless." He paused, then continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I saw you up there on that platform, and I recognized the look in your eyes. That's how my mother looked right before she died, like she'd reached the end of what she could endure. I thought if I could spare you that, if I could offer you a life that had some dignity and hope in it, then maybe all that work would mean something after all. Maybe I could do for you what no one did for my mother." Dahlia felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I'll be a good wife to you," she said quietly. "I'll earn what you've given me. I promise you that." "You already earned it just by saying yes," Kane replied. "Everything else is just us figuring out how to move forward together." The church was small, barely more than a room with a cross on the wall and rough wooden pews. The preacher, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles named Reverend Walsh, looked surprised to see them but agreed to perform the ceremony. There were no guests, no flowers, no music. Just Dahlia and Kane standing before the altar, speaking vows that would bind their lives together. When Kane slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, a ring that looked old and well-worn, Dahlia realized with a start that it must have belonged to his mother. The weight of that gesture, the trust implied in giving her such a precious thing, made her throat tighten with emotion. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Walsh said, and Dahlia's breath caught. She'd been so focused on the legalities and the strangeness of the situation that she'd forgotten this part. She looked up at Kane, suddenly nervous, but he was gentle as he leaned down, pressing a brief, chaste kiss to her lips. It was nothing more than a formality, but she felt the warmth of it spread through her chest nonetheless. They signed the marriage certificate, and just like that, Dahlia Foster became Dahlia Keller. She stared at the name on the paper, still unable to quite believe this was real. Kane had a wagon waiting outside, loaded with supplies. He helped her up onto the seat, his hands steady on her waist, and then climbed up beside her. As they pulled out of Cherry Creek, heading north toward the mountains, Dahlia looked back at the town one last time. Just this morning, she'd been terrified she'd die here, alone and forgotten. Now she was married to a stranger, heading toward a life she couldn't begin to imagine. The ride took nearly 2 hours, following a rough trail that wound through rolling grassland dotted with pine trees. The mountains rose up ahead of them, their peaks still crowned with snow despite it being July. Kane didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. He pointed out landmarks along the way, a creek where he said the fishing was good, a stand of aspens that turned gold in autumn. When they finally crested a hill, and Dahlia saw the ranch spread out below them, she caught her breath. It was beautiful in a stark, wild way. The house was built of logs, larger than she'd expected, with a porch that wrapped around 2 sides. The barn was substantial, painted red, and she could see several other outbuildings scattered around the property. Cattle grazed in the distance, and closer to the house, horses stood in a corral, their coats gleaming in the late afternoon sun. "It's not much," Kane said, a note of uncertainty in his voice that she hadn't heard before. "The house needs work. I've kept it clean enough, but I'm not much for decorating or making things comfortable." "It's wonderful," Dahlia said honestly. After weeks of cramped boarding houses and uncertain futures, the sight of this solid, permanent place made something in her chest loosen. "I've never seen anything so beautiful." Kane looked at her, surprise flickering across his face, and then he smiled. It was the first real smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his features, making him look younger and less careworn. "Wait until winter," he said with a hint of humor. "You might change your mind when you're snowed in for weeks at a time." He drove the wagon down to the house, and as they got closer, Dahlia could see the details he'd mentioned. The porch had a broken rail that needed mending. Some of the chinking between the logs needed repair. But the windows were clean, and there were curtains hanging in them, faded but neat. Someone, probably Kane himself, had tried to make the place look like a home. Inside, the house was sparse but clean. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. There was a table with 4 chairs, a couple of armchairs near the fireplace, and shelves lined with books. Dahlia's eyebrows rose at the sight of the books, everything from agricultural texts to poetry collections. "My mother taught me to read," Kane said, following her gaze. "She said a man without learning was only half a man. I've tried to keep up with it over the years, ordering books when I can afford them." "I love to read," Dahlia said softly, moving closer to the shelves. She recognized some of the titles, had read a few of them herself back when she'd had time for such luxuries. "Then you're welcome to any of them," Kane replied. "There's a bedroom through that door and a smaller room beyond it that I've been using for storage. You should take the main bedroom. I'll move my things to the other room." "Kane, this is your house," Dahlia protested, turning to face him. "I don't expect you to give up your own bedroom. It's our house now," he corrected gently. "And I want you to be comfortable. Like I said, this can be whatever kind of arrangement you need it to be. When you're ready for more, if you're ever ready for more, you just tell me. Until then, we're partners trying to make a life together. That's all." The kindness in his voice, the genuine care in his offer, made Dahlia's eyes burn with unshed tears. She'd been bracing herself for demands, for expectations she wasn't ready to meet. To be given time, to be given space, was a gift she hadn't expected. "Thank you," she managed, "for all of this. I know I haven't earned it yet, but I will." "Stop saying that," Kane said, a hint of frustration creeping into his tone. "You don't have to earn basic human decency. You don't have to earn the right to have a home and food and respect. Those things should be given freely, and the fact that they haven't been is what's wrong with the world, not what's wrong with you." Dahlia stared at him, this man who'd been a stranger just hours ago, and felt something crack open inside her chest. She realized with a start that she'd spent so long thinking of herself as worthless, as a burden, that she'd forgotten there might be another way to see herself. "I'll show you around the rest of the place before it gets dark," Kane said, breaking the moment. "Tomorrow we can start figuring out a routine. There's a lot of work to be done on a ranch this size, and I won't lie to you, I'll need your help. But for tonight, we'll just take things easy." He showed her the bedroom, a decent-sized room with a large bed covered in a faded quilt, a dresser, and a washstand. The window looked out over the corral and the mountains beyond. It was simple, but it was more than Dahlia had dared hope for. Kane brought her small trunk in from the wagon, the one containing everything she owned in the world. "I'll leave you to settle in," he said. "I need to check on the animals before full dark. There's food in the kitchen if you're hungry. Help yourself to anything." After he left, Dahlia sat on the edge of the bed, her legs suddenly weak. The events of the day crashed over her all at once. This morning, she'd been standing on an auction block, facing humiliation and an uncertain future. Now she was married, sitting in a bedroom in a house that was apparently half hers, wearing a gold ring that meant she belonged somewhere again. She allowed herself to cry then, great shuddering sobs that shook her whole body. She cried for the fear, for the relief, for her lost mother and her dead fiancé, for all the hard years that had led her to this moment. She cried until she had no tears left, and then she washed her face in the basin and unpacked her few belongings, hanging her 2 spare dresses in the wardrobe and arranging her hairbrush and the small locket containing her mother's picture on the dresser. When Kane came back in, full dark had fallen and Dahlia had managed to pull herself together. She'd found bread and cheese in the kitchen and had put together a simple meal. Kane looked surprised to see the table set, 2 plates laid out with food. "You didn't have to do that," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "I wanted to," Dahlia replied. "Besides, you said this was a partnership. Partners pull their weight." They ate in companionable silence, and afterward, Kane showed her how to work the pump in the kitchen, where he kept the firewood, how to bank the fire in the stove. He was patient, explaining things clearly, never making her feel foolish for not knowing. When she asked about the ranch work, what needed to be done, he told her about the cattle, the garden that had gone to weeds, the chickens he'd been neglecting because he didn't have time to manage them properly. "I can handle the chickens," Dahlia said. "And the garden. I kept a kitchen garden for my aunt. It wasn't much, but I know the basics." "That would be a help," Kane admitted. "I'm better with cattle than vegetables. We could use fresh food instead of living off preserved goods all the time." They talked until the fire burned low, and Dahlia found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months. Kane was easy to talk to, thoughtful and intelligent. He asked about her life in Philadelphia, and she told him about growing up, about her mother's death, about the fiancé who died before they could marry. "His name was Thomas," she said quietly. "We were supposed to be married in the spring, but he was killed in a machine accident at the textile mill. After that, I lived with my aunt. When she died and left me with nothing, I thought coming west was my only option. A family in Denver advertised for a governess, and I spent my last money on the train ticket. But when I got here, they'd already hired someone else and hadn't bothered to send word." "That's a lot of loss for one person," Kane said, his voice gentle. "I'm sorry you had to go through all that." "We all have our sorrows," Dahlia replied, thinking of what he'd told her about his mother. "The trick is figuring out how to keep living despite them." "Well, we'll figure it out together," Kane said, standing and stretching. "I should let you get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day, getting you settled and showing you everything." That night, lying alone in the big bed, Dahlia listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch. Cattle lowing in the distance, the wind in the pines, the creak of the house settling. It should have been frightening, all this strangeness, but instead she felt a tentative hope stirring in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, this could work. The next morning she woke to find Kane already up, the smell of coffee drifting through the house. She dressed quickly, braiding her hair and splashing water on her face before joining him in the kitchen. "Morning," he said, handing her a cup of coffee. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in weeks," Dahlia admitted. The coffee was strong and hot, and she wrapped her hands around the cup gratefully. "What's the plan for today?" "I thought I'd show you around the property properly, introduce you to how things work." The cattle pretty much take care of themselves this time of year, just need checking on. But there's other work that needs doing, repairs and such. They spent the morning walking the ranch, Kane showing her the boundaries of the property, explaining the different pastures and how he rotated the cattle. He showed her the chicken coop, which had indeed been neglected, and the remnants of a vegetable garden that had gone wild. "My mother planted this," Kane said, looking at the tangled mess of weeds and a few struggling plants. "After she died, I couldn't bring myself to keep it up. Reminded me too much of her." "Would it bother you if I restored it?" Dahlia asked carefully. "I'd understand if it would be painful." Kane was quiet for a moment, then shook his head. "No, I think she'd like knowing it was being tended again. She always said a good garden was the mark of a proper home." Dahlia knelt in the dirt, pulling away some of the weeds to reveal struggling tomato plants underneath. "These can be saved," she said, "and we can plant more. It's late in the season, but we could still get squash and beans, maybe some lettuce." "Whatever you think is best," Kane said. "I'll help when I can, but most of my time needs to be with the cattle. We'll be doing a roundup in a few weeks, getting ready for the drive to market." They worked through the day, falling into an easy rhythm. Kane handled the heavy work, making repairs to the barn and the fences, while Dahlia tackled the garden and the chickens. By evening, she'd cleaned out the coop, collected eggs, and cleared a significant portion of the garden. Over the next few weeks, a pattern emerged. They rose early, worked through the day, and spent the evenings together, talking by the fire. Kane taught Dahlia about the ranch, about reading weather signs and tracking cattle. She taught him how to make bread from scratch, how to preserve vegetables. They learned each other's habits, each other's preferences. And slowly, carefully, they began to become something more than just partners in a business arrangement. Dahlia found herself looking forward to Kane's return each evening, to the sound of his voice and the way he listened when she talked. She noticed small things about him, the way he was gentle with the horses, how he always made sure she had the comfortable chair by the fire, the way he smiled when he found fresh vegetables on the table. Kane, for his part, seemed to soften as the weeks passed. The hard edges that had marked him when they first met began to ease. He laughed more, talked more freely. Dahlia would sometimes catch him watching her as she worked in the garden, an expression on his face that made her heart beat faster. One evening, about a month after their wedding, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The air was warm, carrying the scent of pine and the wildflowers Dahlia had planted near the house. "I'm glad you said yes," Kane said quietly. "That day in town, I'm glad you took the chance on me." "I'm glad you offered," Dahlia replied. She was sitting in one of the porch chairs and Kane was leaning against the railing, his profile outlined against the sunset. "I was so scared that day. I didn't know what was going to happen to me. And then you appeared like something out of a story." "I was scared too," Kane admitted. "Scared you'd say no, scared I was making a fool of myself, but I looked at you up there and I knew I had to try. Why didn't you just bid a reasonable amount?" Dahlia asked, something she'd been wondering about. "You could have won with $100, maybe less. Why offer everything?" Kane turned to look at her, and in the fading light his eyes were dark and serious. "Because you deserve to know your worth." Every other woman that day went for pocket change, like they were nothing more than commodities. "I wanted you to know that to me, you were worth everything, that you were precious and valuable, even if no one else could see it." Dahlia felt her breath catch. "Kane," she whispered, not sure what else to say. He moved closer, kneeling beside her chair so they were at eye level. "Dahlia, I know we agreed to take this slow. I know I said this could be just a partnership if that's what you wanted. But I need you to know that it's become more than that for me. These past weeks, getting to know you, watching you bring life back to this place, I've fallen in love with you. And if you don't feel the same, that's all right. I'll wait. I'll wait as long as it takes, but I had to tell you the truth." Dahlia's eyes filled with tears, but they were good tears this time, tears of joy and relief and a happiness she'd thought she'd never feel again. "I love you too," she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't think I could, not so soon, not after everything. But I do. You've given me a home, a life, a reason to hope again. How could I not love you?" Kane reached up, cupping her face gently in his work-roughened hands. "May I kiss you? Really kiss you, not like at the wedding?" "Yes," Dahlia breathed, and then his lips were on hers, warm and sure. This kiss was nothing like the brief peck they'd shared at the altar. This was deep and real, full of promise and passion. Dahlia melted into it, her hands coming up to rest on his shoulders, feeling the solid strength of him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kane rested his forehead against hers. "Will you come to my room tonight? Will you be my wife in truth?" "Yes," Dahlia said simply. "Yes to everything." That night they came together with a tenderness that made Dahlia's heart ache. Kane was patient and gentle, making sure she was comfortable, that she felt safe. And afterward, lying in his arms in the bed they would now share, Dahlia felt a completeness she'd never experienced before. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it, this sense of belonging, of being cherished, of being home. The seasons turned, summer giving way to autumn. The garden flourished under Dahlia's care, providing them with fresh vegetables that she preserved for the winter. The cattle thrived, and Kane's roundup was successful, bringing in enough money to replenish his savings and make some improvements to the ranch. In October, as the aspens turned gold like Kane had promised, Dahlia realized she was pregnant. She told Kane one evening after supper, watching his face carefully, not sure how he would react to the news coming so soon. For a moment, Kane just stared at her, and then a smile broke across his face like sunshine. "A baby. We're going to have a baby." "In the spring," Dahlia confirmed, and then she was being lifted off her feet, swung around in a circle as Kane laughed with pure joy. "Thank you," he said when he finally set her down, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for giving me a family. Thank you for making this house a home. Thank you for everything." Winter came, and they were indeed snowed in for weeks at a time, but Dahlia didn't mind. They spent the long evenings reading by the fire, Kane with his head in her lap while she knitted tiny garments. They talked about names, about the future, about all the dreams they'd once thought impossible that were now within reach. "If it's a boy, I'd like to name him after my father," Kane said one night. "Not because he deserves it, but because I want to reclaim that name. Make it mean something good instead of something shameful." "What was his name?" Dahlia asked. "Kenneth. We could call him Kenny." "And if it's a girl," Kane smiled, "then you should choose. You're doing all the hard work after all." "Margaret," Dahlia said, "after my mother." "We could call her Maggie." "Kenneth or Margaret," Kane said, placing his hand on Dahlia's belly, which was just beginning to swell. "Either way, they'll be loved. That's the promise I make right now. Our child will never know what it's like to be unwanted, to wonder if they're valued. They'll grow up knowing they're precious." The baby came in late April, a long labor that had Kane pacing the floor while the midwife from town, Mrs. Patterson, tended to Dahlia. When the baby's first cry split the air, Kane burst into the bedroom, his face white with worry. "A boy, Mrs. Patterson announced, wrapping the infant in a clean blanket. "Healthy and strong, just like his father." Dahlia, exhausted but glowing, held out her arms for the baby. Kane sat beside her on the bed, and together they looked down at their son, at Kenneth James Keller, named for two fathers and destined to be better than either. "He's perfect," Kane whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger. "You're perfect. Thank you, Dahlia. Thank you for this gift. We made him together," Dahlia said, leaning against Kane's shoulder. "This is our gift, not just mine." Kenny was an easy baby, quick to smile and slow to fuss. He grew like a weed through the summer, and by the time autumn came around again, he was crawling and getting into everything. The house echoed with his laughter, with the sounds of life and love. One evening, when Kenny was about 10 months old, Dahlia and Kane sat on the porch again, watching their son toddle around on unsteady legs, chasing after one of the barn cats. The mountains were painted with the colors of sunset, and the air smelled of pine and approaching winter. "Do you ever think about that day?" Kane asked. "The auction." "Sometimes," Dahlia admitted. "It feels like a lifetime ago, like it happened to someone else." "I think about it all the time," Kane said. "I think about how close I came to not going into town that day. I had work to do, didn't really want to make the trip. But something told me to go, and when I got there and saw you, I knew why. It was like everything I'd been through, every hard thing I'd survived had been leading me to that moment. I was so angry at first," Dahlia confessed. "Angry at the circumstances that led me there, angry at myself for ending up in that position. But now I look back and I'm grateful. If things had been different, if I'd gotten that governess job or if Thomas hadn't died, I never would have met you. I never would have had this life." "Strange how the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes," Kane mused. "I gave up everything I had that day, and in return I got everything I ever wanted." "You didn't give it up," Dahlia corrected. "You invested it, and look at the return, a family, a home full of love, a future full of hope." Kenny chose that moment to tumble over, landing on his bottom in the grass. He looked up at them with wide eyes, and for a second, his face crumpled like he might cry. But then Kane started clapping and cheering, and the baby's expression changed to one of delight. He clapped his own hands together, mimicking his father, laughter bubbling up from his chest. "Just like life," Dahlia said softly. "You fall down, but if you have people who love you, who cheer you on, you get back up and try again." The years flowed by like the creek that ran through their property, constant and life-giving. When Kenny was 3, Dahlia gave birth to their daughter, Margaret Ann, who had her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair. Maggie was more spirited than Kenny, always into mischief, keeping them all on their toes. The ranch prospered. With Dahlia's help, Kane was able to expand the operation, buying adjacent land when a neighbor moved back east. They hired help during the busy seasons, and Kane became known throughout the territory as a fair employer and an honest man. The name Kenneth Keller, which had once been associated with shame and loss, was now respected. Dahlia became involved in the growing community, helping to establish a school in Cherry Creek, teaching children to read. She never forgot what it was like to be desperate and alone, and she made it her mission to help other women who found themselves in difficult circumstances. More than one pregnant girl or abandoned wife found their way to the Keller Ranch, where they were given work and dignity and a chance to start over. "You're building quite a reputation," Kane teased her one evening after she'd brought home yet another stray, a young widow with 2 children who needed a place to stay while she got back on her feet. "St. Dahlia of Cherry Creek." "Stop it," Dahlia said, swatting his arm. "I'm just doing what someone did for me, offering a hand up when it's needed." "I know," Kane said, pulling her close. "It's one of the many reasons I love you. You have the biggest heart of anyone I've ever known." When Kenny turned 10, Kane began teaching him the ranching business in earnest. The boy took to it naturally, showing his father's patience with animals and his mother's head for figures. Maggie, at 7, declared she wanted to be a rancher too, and Kane, to his credit, never told her she couldn't because she was a girl. Instead, he taught her everything he taught Kenny, and she proved just as capable. One evening, sitting around the dinner table with his family, Kane looked at Dahlia across the worn wood, noting the silver starting to thread through her brown hair, the laugh lines around her eyes. She was talking with the children about something, her face animated, her hands gesturing. She'd never been conventionally beautiful, but to Kane, she was the most beautiful woman in the world. As if sensing his gaze, Dahlia looked up and smiled at him, that special smile she reserved just for him. Even after more than a decade of marriage, it still made his heart skip a beat. "What are you thinking about?" she asked later, after the children were in bed and they were sitting in their usual spots by the fire. "About how lucky I am," Kane replied. "About how different my life could have been." "Our lives," Dahlia corrected. "How different our lives could have been." "Do you have any regrets?" Kane asked. "Anything you wish had been different?" Dahlia considered the question seriously. "I wish my mother could have known you, known the children. I wish she could have seen that I found happiness after all. And I wish I could go back and tell that scared girl on the auction block that everything was going to be all right, that the best thing that ever happened to her was about to walk out of that crowd. I wish I could tell my mother that I finally understood what she meant about building a legacy," Kane said. "That it's not about the land or the money or the cattle, it's about love. It's about creating something that lasts, something that matters." "You've done that," Dahlia assured him. "We've done that together." As the years continued to pass, Kenny grew into a fine young man, eventually taking over more of the ranch operations. At 20, he met a girl from Denver, a schoolteacher named Sarah, and brought her home to meet his parents. Watching Kenny court Sarah with respect and tenderness, Kane felt a deep satisfaction. His son had learned well, had learned that a woman was to be cherished, not controlled. Kenny and Sarah married, and eventually, Maggie found love too, with a veterinarian who set up practice in Cherry Creek. Both children stayed close, building houses on the ranch property, raising families of their own. The Keller Ranch became something of a small community, 3 generations working and living together in harmony. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Kane surprised Dahlia with a trip. They left the ranch in Kenny's capable hands and traveled to Denver, spending a week in a fine hotel, eating in restaurants and going to the theater. It was a luxury they'd never indulged in before, and Dahlia was enchanted by it all. "Why now?" she asked as they sat in the hotel restaurant, dressed in their finest clothes. "Why spend the money on this?" "Because I wanted to show you off," Kane said simply. "I wanted the world to see the remarkable woman I married. And because we've spent 20 years building something together, and that deserves to be celebrated." "I don't need fancy dinners or hotels," Dahlia said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "All I need is you." "I know," Kane replied, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "But you deserve nice things too. You deserve to be spoiled a little bit." When they returned to the ranch, they found it running smoothly without them, proof that the next generation was ready to carry on what they'd built. It was both satisfying and bittersweet, the realization that they were no longer quite as necessary as they'd once been. "That's what we worked for," Kane reminded Dahlia when she expressed this feeling. "We wanted to build something that would last beyond us. Looks like we succeeded." They settled into the slower pace of their later years with grace. Kane still worked every day, but he left the heavy labor to younger men. Dahlia still tended her garden, still helped women in need, but she had more time for the grandchildren who were starting to arrive, more time to simply enjoy the life they'd created. One summer evening, when they were both in their 60s, they sat on the porch as they'd done countless times before. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting everything in shades of gold. Kenny's oldest son was out in the corral, working with a young horse, and they could hear Maggie's daughter singing in the kitchen as she helped with dinner preparations. "Remember when I told you I'd give you everything I had?" Kane asked, his voice soft with the weight of memory. "I remember," Dahlia replied, her hand in his, their fingers interlaced. "I didn't know then what everything really meant," Kane continued. "I thought I was offering land and cattle, a house and security, but that wasn't everything. Everything was the life we'd build together, the family we'd create, the love that would grow between us. Everything was every morning waking up next to you, every shared meal, every laugh, every tear, every moment of joy and struggle. That's what I really gave you, my entire life, my entire heart. And you gave me yours in return. And I'd do it again," Dahlia said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Every single time. If I had to stand on that auction block 1,000 times knowing it would lead me to you, I'd do it gladly." "You were the bride no one bid on," Kane murmured. "But you were also the only bride I ever wanted, the only woman I ever loved. Funny how that worked out." "Not funny," Dahlia corrected gently. "Perfect. It worked out perfectly." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The sounds of their family drifted around them, the legacy they'd created together, born from a moment of desperation and transformed by love into something beautiful and enduring. Years later, when they were both gone, their grandchildren would tell the story of how their grandparents met, the tale becoming family legend. The bride no one wanted and the rancher who gave everything he had to save her, how they'd built an empire of love from the ashes of their separate sorrows. But on that evening, sitting on the porch of the home they'd made together, Kane and Dahlia didn't think about legends or legacies. They simply held hands, watched the sunset, and were grateful for the extraordinary ordinary life they'd created together, one day, one moment, one choice at a time. The house that had once been empty and silent now rang with life and laughter across the generations. The ranch that Kane had built alone now sustained dozens of people, all connected by the choice one man made to see the worth in a woman everyone else had overlooked. And the love that had begun as an impossible gamble had grown into something so strong and true that it would echo through time. Proof that sometimes the things we're willing to give up everything for are the very things that make us whole. Kenny took over the ranch fully when Kane's health began to decline in his late 70s. But the old rancher still spent his days sitting on that porch, Dahlia beside him, watching the cattle graze and the mountains stand eternal. They'd seen droughts and harsh winters, good years and bad, but through it all, they'd had each other, and that had made all the difference. On a crisp autumn day, with leaves falling like gold coins around them and the air sharp with the promise of winter, Kane and Dahlia celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. The entire family gathered, children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, filling the house and spilling out onto the land. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, and toasts to the couple who had started it all. "Tell us the story," one of the great-grandchildren demanded, a little girl about 6 with Dahlia's green eyes. "Tell us how you met." Kane and Dahlia exchanged a glance, a lifetime of love and understanding passing between them in that single look. Then Dahlia began the tale, her voice still strong despite her years. "Once upon a time, there was a girl who thought her life was over," she started. "She was standing in a dusty town, afraid and alone, and no one wanted her. But then a man stepped forward, a man who saw something in her that no one else could see, and he offered her not just a home but a future, not just security but love, and together they built something that would last forever." "What did he see in you, great-grandma?" the little girl asked. Dahlia looked at Kane, her eyes shining with tears and joy. "Tell her," she said softly. Kane reached over and took Dahlia's hand, holding it as he'd held it thousands of times before. "I saw strength," he said. "I saw courage. I saw a woman who'd been knocked down by life but refused to stay down. I saw grace and dignity and a heart big enough to hold the whole world. I saw the woman I wanted to spend my life with, even if I didn't fully know it yet. I saw everything I'd ever need." "And what did you see in him?" another grandchild asked Dahlia. "Kindness," Dahlia replied without hesitation. "When the world had shown me cruelty, he showed me kindness. He saw me as a person, not a commodity. He offered me choices, not demands. He gave me respect when I'd been given none. And in time, I saw so much more. I saw integrity and humor and gentleness and strength. I saw the man I would love for the rest of my life." The celebration continued around them, but Kane and Dahlia sat together, content to watch their legacy unfold. This was what that impulsive decision 50 years ago had created. This vast web of love and connection. All of these lives that existed because a desperate man and a desperate woman had taken a chance on each other. As the sun set on their anniversary, painting the sky in those familiar shades of gold and purple, Kane felt the weight of his years. His body was tired, worn down by decades of hard work and hard living, but his heart was full, fuller than he'd ever imagined possible. "I love you," he whispered to Dahlia as the party wound down and the family began to disperse. "I've loved you every day for 50 years, and I'll love you for however many days we have left." "And I love you," Dahlia replied, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life that day in Cherry Creek. You gave me a reason to keep going when I'd run out of reasons. You showed me what it means to be truly loved." "We saved each other," Kane corrected. "That house was empty before you came. I was empty. You filled everything up with light and life. You made everything worth it." They sat together until the stars came out, neither wanting to break the spell of the evening. Around them, the ranch settled into its nighttime rhythms, familiar and comforting. The cattle bedded down, the horses dozed in their stalls, the chickens roosted in their coop. The garden, still productive even in autumn, waited for morning frost. And the house, that house that had witnessed so much life and love, stood solid and strong, a testament to everything they'd built together. In the years that followed, Kane's health continued to decline, but he faced it with the same quiet strength he'd shown in life. Dahlia tended him with fierce devotion, refusing to let anyone else take over his care. On a cold January morning, with snow falling soft and silent outside, Kane passed away peacefully in his sleep, Dahlia's hand in his. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of Colorado. Kane had touched many lives over the years, had helped countless people, and they came to pay their respects. But it was the words of his family that truly captured who he'd been. "My father taught me that a man's worth isn't measured by what he has, but by what he gives," Kenny said in his eulogy. He gave everything he had for love, and in return, he received everything worth having. He left this world richer than he came into it, not in money or possessions, but in the love he created and the lives he touched. Maggie added her own tribute. "Daddy showed me that being strong doesn't mean being hard. He was the gentlest man I ever knew, but also the strongest. He faced every challenge with courage and every person with kindness. And he loved our mother with a devotion that I hope everyone gets to experience at least once in their lives." Dahlia was quiet through most of the service, but when they lowered Kane into the ground on a hill overlooking the ranch, she spoke. "Wait for me," she whispered. "I'll be along soon and we'll walk together again." She lived for 3 more years, still tending her garden in summer, still helping women in need, still keeping Kane's memory alive. She told stories about him to the great-grandchildren, making sure they knew the man who had started it all. And every evening, no matter the weather, she sat on the porch and talked to him as if he were still beside her, sharing the events of the day and the funny things the children had said. On a warm spring evening, as the aspens were just beginning to leaf out and the first wildflowers were pushing through the soil, Dahlia felt a familiar presence. She was sitting in her chair on the porch, wrapped in one of Kane's old blankets, and suddenly the air seemed to shimmer. "Took you long enough," Kane's voice said, and when Dahlia looked up, there he was, young and strong as he'd been the day they met, that same intense expression in his gray eyes. "You're here," Dahlia breathed, and she realized she was young too, the aches and pains of age suddenly gone. "I'm here," Kane confirmed, holding out his hand. "I promised I'd wait. Did you think I'd break that promise?" Dahlia stood, taking his hand, feeling the familiar warmth and strength of it. "What happens now? Now we keep going," Kane said, pulling her close. "Together like always." "The story doesn't end, Dahlia. It just keeps unfolding, page after page, chapter after chapter." The family found her the next morning, peacefully gone in her sleep, a smile on her face. They buried her next to Kane on the hill, under a simple stone that read, "Kane and Dahlia Keller." He offered everything. She gave everything. Together they had everything. The ranch continued, passing down through the generations. Kenny's children took over from him, and then their children after them. The house was maintained, expanded, but never fundamentally changed. The porch where Kane and Dahlia had spent so many evenings remained, and family members would often sit there, feeling the presence of the couple who had started it all. The story of the bride no one bid on, and the rancher who offered everything became more than just family lore. It was written up in history books, used as an example of how love could flourish even in the harshest circumstances, how the act of seeing value where others saw none could change the trajectory of countless lives. Cherry Creek grew into a proper town, and eventually a small city, but the Keller Ranch remained, a piece of the Old West preserved and protected. Visitors would sometimes come, asking to hear the story, and whoever was around would tell it, each generation adding their own details but always keeping the heart of the tale the same. Because at its core, it was a simple story. A woman who needed saving, a man who needed purpose, and the love that bloomed between them when they took a leap of faith. It was about seeing past the surface to the person beneath, about valuing someone not for what they could give you but for who they were. It was about building something lasting, something beautiful, something that would echo through time. And in the end, it was about the truth that the best things in life often come from our darkest moments, that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what really matters, and that the willingness to give up everything for love is what makes love worth having. The auction platform in Cherry Creek was torn down years ago, replaced by modern buildings and paved streets. But if you know where to look, there's a small plaque marking the spot where it once stood. It tells the story briefly, a simple inscription. Here in 1878, Kane Keller offered everything he had for love. In return, he received everything worth having. May we all be so wise. And on quiet evenings, when the wind blows down from the mountains, and the sun sets in shades of gold and purple, if you stand on the porch of the old Keller Ranch house and listen carefully, you can almost hear them. The soft murmur of voices, the sound of laughter, the rustle of skirts and the creak of porch boards. The ghosts of Kane and Dahlia, forever sitting together, forever in love, forever home. The garden still blooms every summer, tended by the latest generation of Kellers. The cattle still graze in the pastures, The mountains still stand eternal, and the house still stands solid and strong. And somewhere, in some place beyond this one, Kane and Dahlia Keller walk hand in hand, their love as fresh and new as it was that day in Cherry Creek when a desperate rancher made an impossible offer, and a desperate woman was brave enough to say yes. Their story proves that sometimes the things we're afraid to lose are exactly what we need to risk to truly live. That sometimes the person everyone else overlooks is the very person who will change your life. That sometimes an ending is really just a beginning in disguise. And that love, real love, the kind that lasts forever, is always worth everything you have to give and more. The sun sets, the stars come out, and the story continues, passed down from generation to generation. A reminder that in a world that often measures worth in all the wrong ways, the truest measure is how we love, how we give, and how we see the value in those around us. Kane and Dahlia Keller knew that truth, lived that truth, and their legacy stands as proof that even in the wild and uncertain West, love could tame any frontier and build any dream, so long as two people were willing to face it together.